You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we're previewing the Test series between Australia and the West Indies. It's Deja Vu Groundhog Day again, as the West Indies return to Australia for another Test series after the Test series in 2022-23 last summer. They're back here again. Will it be deja vu for the West Indies, or can they show some fight and character? And can this young, inexperienced West Indian side challenge Australia in 2023-24? That will be the big question. Australia, on the other hand, looking to end the Test summer on a high after a very convincing 3-0 series victory over Pakistan. They'll be looking to finish the Test summer on a high in this series against the West Indies. Australia looking to retain the Sir Frank Worrell Trophy for the 13th consecutive time. And this series for Australia marks the end and the beginning of life after David Warner, following his retirement, Steve Smith to open, and Cameron Green to bat at number 4. So it will be an interesting series for Australia, purely based on Smith as the new opener and Green at number 4, and obviously life after David Warner. So it's going to be an interesting series between Australia and the West Indies. Lots to talk about, lots to unpack in this preview today. So without further ado, let's get into it. And first of all, let's have a look at the Test series fixture between Australia and the West Indies. There's 2 Test matches in this series. The first Test will be at the Adelaide Oval. That will be on the 17th of January. And the second and final Test will be in Brisbane at the Gabba. It will be a day-night Test, that one. And that will be on the 25th of January. To mark the end of the series, but also the Australian Test summer as well. So that's the Test series fixture between Australia and the West Indies. Let's have a look at the Test stats between Australia and the West Indies in Test matches throughout their history. And head-to-head overall record in Test matches, Australia lead that 60-32 to the West Indies. Both teams' records in Australia in Test matches. Australia have won 39 to the West Indies, 18 Test matches they've won in Australia. Leading run scorer, no surprise, Brian Lara with 2,815 runs. Leading wicket taker, Courtney Walsh with 135 wickets. Most dismissals, Jeff Dujon with 84. Most catches, Mark Waugh with 45. Most matches, Courtney Walsh with 38. And the first Test match played between Australia and the West Indies was back in 1930. So those are the Test stats between Australia and the West Indies. Let's talk about how both Australia and the West Indies will go about their business in this Test series. Talk about both squads and the areas that they need to focus on, and how they'll go about things in this Test series. We'll start with Australia, the home side. Let's have a look at their squad. Cummins, Boland, Carey, Green, Hazelwood, Head, Khawaja, Labuschagne, Lyon, Mitchell Marsh, Renshaw, Smith, and Stark. First of all, it's a pretty strong squad. Obviously, no David Warner because he's retired, and Matt Renshaw was selected ahead of the other openers in Bancroft and Harris to come into the squad. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But it's a pretty strong squad that Australia have assembled. Obviously, coming off a good series win against Pakistan recently, 3-0. And you would think they should do well in this series. They should dominate. They should win the series 2-0, like they did in the last series last summer, back in 2022-23. Obviously, strong batting and bowling lineups should cause some problems for the West Indies in those departments. Australia, they have a firm grip on the Sir Frank Worrell Trophy. Australia have held the trophy since 1995, that famous win in the Caribbean, led by Mark Taylor. Ever since then, Australia have had their grip on the Sir Frank Worrell Trophy. They're looking to win it for the 13th consecutive time since then, and they should be able to do that. As I said, pretty strong batting and bowling lineups. Australia in the last series, in terms of the batting and bowling, did very well in the last series. Marnus Labuschagne scored that 200 in Perth. He scored over 500 runs in the series. Travis Head scored that 175 in Adelaide. Steve Smith scored that double century in Perth in the first test in the last series. And did pretty well with the bat and scored some big runs. Usman Khawaja in the last series had a pretty good series, scored 178 runs. David Warner, obviously retired now, not a part of the team anymore. Alex Carey, 49 runs he scored in the last series as well. So and Cameron Green scored 14 runs in the last series as well. He'll be hoping to score more runs at number 4, given Australia have reshaken the batting lineup, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the Australian batters had a pretty good time of it in the last series in 2022, 2023. The bowlers as well had a pretty good series last time around. Nathan Lyon took 12 wickets, Stark 9, Pat Cummins took 3. He only played the one test, Cummins. He was injured for the second test in the last series. Cameron Green took a couple of wickets. Josh Hazlewood only played the one test. He was injured after the first test in Perth in the last series. He took 2 wickets. Travis Head took 2 wickets as well in the last series. So the Australian bowlers and batters had a pretty good hit out against the West Indies in the last series. You would think they should do the same again. Obviously, in the recent series against Pakistan, the batting wasn't quite at their fluent best, but we saw some good signs from Labuschagne, especially in the last test against Pakistan, starting to get his rhythm and timing back. Travis Head had a quiet series. He'll be hoping for a big series against the West Indies. Mitchell Marsh had a pretty good series against Pakistan, looking to continue that form. Usman Khawaja, new opening partnership with Steve Smith. Be interesting to see how he goes. Life after David Warner. Alex Carey's in good form, starting to score runs, as we saw that towards the back end of the Pakistan series. Cameron Green at number 4, opportunity for him to kickstart his career and get going in Test cricket. So the batters would like to score some runs in this series. The bowling attack in good touch as well. So it's a pretty strong Australian team, World Test Championship winners. Going to be a tough challenge for the West Indies to try and topple this Australian team. As I mentioned, the big talking point going into the series was obviously Steve Smith to open, Cameron Green to bat at number 4. Quite an interesting discussion that many people had about this. Big talking point, new challenge for Steve Smith to open the batting, replacing David Warner. He put up his hand. He said, yes, I want to open the batting. Cameron Green at number 4, give him an opportunity to be in the side and be in the team. Purely, we've had this discussion mainly to get Cameron Green back into the side because Mitchell Marsh doing so well. You can't drop Mitchell Marsh because he's doing so well at the moment, and rightly so. He deserves his good form and fortune, Mitchell Marsh. Ever since he's come back, he's done well. And for Cameron Green, a young player, the selectors thought, well, we need to get him in the side ASAP. We can't have him on the sidelines not playing any cricket. So that's why they went with Smith to open, Green at number 4. Cameron Green has a good record at number 4 for WA. In Sheffield Shield cricket, Steve Smith hasn't opened the batting before, but a new challenge, new opportunity for him in this series against the West Indies to have that new challenge and motivation. I know some people were against Smith opening the batting. Some pundits, like Ricky Ponting and others, didn't want him to open the batting. They wanted a specialist opener. But I suppose this is the best way for Australia to get Cameron Green in the side, purely because they want him to be involved in the team. They can't drop Marsh, as I mentioned before, because he hasn't done anything wrong since he's come back. So only time will tell whether or not the experiment of Smith and Green at number 4 and opening the batting for Smith will work. Australia will have 2 test matches against the West Indies. They'll have 2 test matches against New Zealand. We can only make an assessment after those test matches whether or not the experiment was a success or a failure. But, there's two sides of the coin. You can look at it. Yes, Cameron Bancroft, he was in the running to be selected as opener, could be hard done by, would be angry and disappointed. Of course he would. It's only a natural response to feel like that. But purely it's because to try and get Cameron Green in the side. So, with Smith, it's a new challenge for him. And we've seen Steve Smith struggle in recent years. Maybe this is a good opportunity for him to really get that motivation back. As an athlete, towards the end of your career, if you've been very successful at your sport or profession like Steve Smith has done, he's been arguably one of the best batters in the world for a very long time, averaging close to 60. He's achieved everything in the game. You need something new and something different. And judging by what he's said in the media, in the press, he said, I want to do it. I'm more than willing to bat up the order and do that. And it's a new challenge for me. So I think it could bring the best out of Smith. We could see Smith return to some sort of his best, not quite at his best, but back to what we know from Smith. And I think opening would probably just do that. And with Cameron Green in particular at number 4, good opportunity for Cameron Green to, move up the order, get back into the test side. He's been out for some time since the third test of the Ashes at Headingley when he was injured. Marsh came in, scored 100, and ever since then, Marsh has done very well. So I think for Green, I think it's an opportunity for him to express himself, really kickstart his test career. It's been stuttering since he debuted. He's a young man. He's got a lot of potential, a lot of talent. So I don't blame the selectors for doing this, bringing Smith up the order to open, have Green at number 4, where he's felt comfortable in Sheffield Shield cricket at number 4. He has a pretty good record, averaging 50 plus. But that's in Sheffield Shield cricket. That's domestic cricket. So we won't know whether or not he will have success at number 4, Cameron Green, until he has a long run of it at number 4. So this series against the West Indies, the series in New Zealand to follow in February, will be a good indication whether or not he is suited to number 4 at test level. But we won't know until it actually happens. We won't know until the series is played, whether or not the experiment has worked or not. But I can see why the selectors have made that, and people will have different views about this. But as a selector, the selectors have made the decisions purely based off getting Cameron Green in the side, because they can't drop Mitchell Marsh because he can't. As I mentioned, he's just doing so well. So that's been a big talking point going into this series for Australia in terms of how will Smith go about opening. He's got the technique. He can do it. He's more than capable of doing it. Cameron Green, be interesting to see how he goes about batting that number 4. So that's being a big talking point going into this series for Australia. Besides from that, if we're focusing on the series as a whole, strong batting, strong bowling, it's a strong team. Australia should dominate as they did in the last series in 2022, 2023. I think some players will be earning to cash in with both bat and with the ball, especially some of the Australian batters that missed out in the Pakistan series, like Travis Head, for example. He had a pretty quiet series. And also Marnus Labuschagne looking to get back into some touch as well. So there's plenty to play for Australia in terms of finishing the test summer off on a high, but also players looking to get some runs and wickets and hoping to put in a good performance against the West Indies. So besides from Smith opening, Green at number 4, be interesting to see how that experiment goes in this series. Besides from that, Australia, a pretty strong team. They should dominate against the West Indies. Realistically speaking, be a good opportunity for them to really improve as a team going forward, this Australian team, looking to ever improve and get better. And they've played some good cricket in the last little period. So just to finish off about Australia, typical Australian test squad, pretty strong, a lot of good players in there, strong batting, strong bowling. As I said, it'd be interesting to see how Smith goes as opener, Green at number 4 in terms of that experiment. that's been the big talking point. But besides from that, I think Australia should have a pretty good series against the West Indies and should dominate, should retain the Sir Frank Worrell Trophy. And they should win the series 2-0 in the end. But you never know. The West Indies may make it hard for them, just like Pakistan did. Even though Australia won that series against Pakistan 3-0, Pakistan did make it hard for Australia, especially in the last 2 tests. So let's hope the West Indies can do that. That's a perfect way to talk about the West Indies squad and talk about their objectives and goals in the series. So let's talk about the West Indies. First of all, let's have a look at their squad that they've selected for this series against Australia. Braithwaite, Chanderpaul, De Silva, McKenzie, Afanase, Greaves, Hodge, Azari Joseph, Jordan, Shamar Joseph, Moti, Roach, Sinclair, Imlach, and McCaskey. And that's the West Indian test squad that they've selected for this series against Australia. Now, for the West Indies, it's a young, inexperienced squad. There's 7 uncapped players in this squad. And the uncapped players who are in the squad, the 7 uncapped players are McCaskey, Imlach, Greaves, Hodge, Sinclair, Jordan, and Shamar Joseph. Those are the uncapped players, the 7 of them that have been selected in this test squad for the West Indies for this series against Australia. So it's a young, inexperienced squad. There's only 5 players who return to this tour of Australia in 2023-24. There's only 5 players that have remained from the squad that toured in 2022-23 in that series last summer. There's only 5 of them that have returned. That's Craig Braithwaite, the captain, Kemar Roach, Asari Joseph, Joshua De Silva, and Tagnarayan Chanderpaul, who made his debut in that series last summer. Those are the only 5 players to return and who were a part of the original squad in 2022-2023. The players who were a part of the last tour in 2022-23 that haven't been selected for this tour, again in Australia, there's no Jason Holder, there's no Kyle Mayers, there's no Jaden Seals, there's no Jermaine Blackwood, there's no Bonner, there's no Shamar Brooks, Roston Chase, Anderson Phillip, Raymond Reefer, and Devon Thomas. Those are the players who were selected for the last tour that are not selected for this tour. So the West Indies have completely overturned their squad from the last squad that toured Australia last summer. So, as I mentioned, inexperienced young squad. The result in 2022-23, they lost 2-0. Both test matches, they lost by big margins. And for the West Indies, it's a long time since they've won a test series in Australia. The last time you'll have to go back for the West Indies to win a test series in Australia was back in 1992-93. And that was the famous test match in Adelaide where they won by a run to win the series. That's the last series win for the West Indies in Australia. That's 30-odd years ago now. The last win for the West Indies in Australia in terms of a test victory was back in 96-97. And in that series, they won 2 test matches. Australia won the series 3-2 in the best of 5. The West Indies won 2 test matches. And that's the last time the West Indies have won a test in Australia. In terms of the West Indies winning a test match against Australia overall, you have to go back to 2003, the famous run chase in Antigua and St. John's, where they chased down 418 for 7. That's the last time the West Indies have won a test overall against Australia in both Australia and the Caribbean. So it's a very long time. It's nearly 20-odd years ago since that happened. So the West Indies have had a bit of a tough period against Australia since then, and it's all been one-way traffic. Not a surprise given how the West Indies are struggling at the moment. And the West Indies have won 4 test series in Australia. Australia have won 10 plus 1 drawn series between Australia and the West Indies in terms of test series in Australia overall. So it's definitely been tough over the last few years for the West Indies, especially when it comes to success in Australia. In terms of their squad, it is an inexperienced squad that a lot of the players are quite inexperienced. There's not much experience here. 7 uncapped players, as I mentioned. But for the West Indies, the big question is, can they score runs and can they take 20 wickets? That's the big concern that I have. That's their biggest challenge. They need to find a way to stay in the contest if they can, try and grind it out with the bat. Can they get through Hazelwood, Stark, Cummins and Lyon? That's going to be difficult. Can they score runs against them? Can they take 20 wickets? Can they get through the Australian batting lineup? Can they put them under some sort of pressure with the ball? Some sort of pressure. Those are going to be the challenges for the West Indies, big challenges that they face. So they really need their batters to stand up in terms of Craig Braithwaite, the captain in particular. In the last series, he was the leading run scorer, Craig Braithwaite. He scored 196 runs. He scored that 110 in Perth in the first test. And that was in the second innings where the West Indies were chasing 498 to win. They finished on 333 all out. But Craig Braithwaite scored that 100. And it showed a bit of fighting character in that innings. So he's going to be an important figure with the bat. You've also got Tagnarayan Chandapal as well, who debuted in the last series here in Australia. Scored a half century. I think that was in Adelaide in the second test in the first innings. So you got to rely on him as well. Also, Joshua De Silva, the keeper, he scored 100 recently in the warm-up match against a Cricket Australia 11. Also, one of the uncapped players, a couple of them, Hodge, he scored 52 and 99. Justin Greaves scored 65 and 41 not out. Those batters are probably most likely to debut for the West Indies in terms of the uncapped players getting an opportunity. So they need to score some runs as well. It's going to be tough for those uncapped players coming in up against an Australian side that are well experienced. So for the West Indies, there's a lot of good signs from that warm-up match against the CA11 before this first test match. A lot of good signs there. There's one bowler in particular who can bowl with raw pace, and that's Shamar Joseph, who can bowl some real pace. Apparently, reports coming out of that warm-up match is that this guy can bowl fast. And that's something that the West Indies need in their bowling attack. You've got Kemar Roach, who's going to lead the attack, very well-seasoned veteran. He's been around for a lot of years, Kemar Roach. Another tour for Australia for him. I remember when he toured in the early 2000s. Remember that 2009 period when the West Indies came out for that series in 2009-10. He's been a very well-experienced bowler. So you would think he's going to probably lead the attack along with Azari Joseph, and then you've got other bowlers who will come in. Maybe a Shamar Joseph may debut and add that little bit of pace that the West Indies need in their bowling attack, because medium paces aren't going to get you the job done in Australia. You need that pace. He's got that pace apparently, so we won't be surprised if he makes a debut in this series and bowls fast on the speed gun. But for the West Indies, they need that bit of extra pace. The last time they came out here last summer, their bowling attack was quite innocuous. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't troubling the Australian batters because it was all similar pace. Even the spin struggled as well. And that's another thing for the West Indies. Can their spinners take wickets as well and support the quicks and support the other bowlers? As we know in Australia, it's very hard to bowl finger spin if you bowl finger spin. So that's going to be another challenge for them as well, taking wickets. Do they have enough speed in the air and velocity to trouble the Australian batters with real pace? And they do have that in Shamar Joseph, who can bowl fast, apparently. So it'll be exciting to see what he can do if he does get an opportunity. But also their spinners, can they take wickets as well? So the West Indies, they've got to score enough runs. They're going to take wickets to stay in the contest and challenge Australia. Realistically speaking, they're not going to win the series. I think that's going to be a bit of a stretch. But if they can show a bit of competitiveness and fight, like Pakistan did in the recent series that Australia played against Pakistan, they showed a bit of fight and character. The West Indies, they've got to show that as well. Just stay in the contest, and grind it out if you can. I think everyone watching this series would like to see that from the West Indies. I think internally, from the inside, the West Indies would say to themselves, you know what, realistically speaking, if we're competitive, if someone from a batting point of view scores 100, if someone from a bowling point of view takes 5 wickets or trouble the Australian batters, then I think that's a really successful tour and the objectives and the goals have been achieved. So for the West Indies, they're a young, inexperienced team, but they've got a lot of potential. They're a team that's rebuilding. We know the problems that the West Indies have had over the years. The decline has been sad to watch, but hopefully they can be competitive. It's an unknown side. There's 7 uncapped players, very unknown what they can do in terms of what they can do from a cricketing point of view. And many Australian supporters and fans would probably not know a lot about these uncapped players. So it'd be interesting to see if they do make their debut. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them, if they do get their opportunity, it'd be interesting to see what they're made of and what sort of cricketers they are and what sort of talents they have with the bat and with the ball. But for the West Indies, they will need to, play very well to stay in the contest. And I think that's the important thing for the West Indies. Try and stay in the contest as long as you can with bat and ball. Try and make it hard for Australia if you can. And I think if they can do that and then they look back on this tour and say, you know what, we did what we needed to do. We were competitive. We did make it hard for Australia. Yes, probably we didn't win the series, but at least we were competitive. We fought hard and we made it tough for Australia. I think that's going to be the realistic goal for the West Indies as a team here. As I said, they've got nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. There's no expectations on the West Indies. No one rates them in this series. Obviously, Australia very strong, but that's beside the point. The point is for them to play this series against Australia, you've got to learn the hard way, but you also get better and learn by going through these tough periods in a rebuild. So if they can come out better cricketers at the end of this series, I think that's a good thing. And it's very important that the West Indies get back on track. Cricket is stronger if there's a good, strong West Indian team. And they've had a rich history. They've had, the golden era when they were dominant for so long. I think everyone wants to see them, perform to their best again because everyone just wants to see the West Indies do well. And hopefully in this series, they can do that against Australia. It's going to be a challenge, but they've got nothing to lose. Go out there, express yourself with the bat, with the ball. Go out there, show us what you can do. This young, inexperienced side. You never know. They may surprise us all. But we will have to wait and see until the series finishes in a few weeks from now. So that's the West Indian Test squad, and that's my thoughts on the West Indies squad and their chances and what they need to do to try and be competitive in this series against Australia. Let's talk about predictions and let's predict who's gonna win the series first and foremost. I think that's a fairly obvious prediction there, but also who's going to be the leading run scorer and leading wicket taker in the series as well. So we'll start off with who will win the series. It's fairly obvious. Australia should win the series 2-0, like they did back in 2022, 2023, where they won 2-0 in the last series last summer. So Australia should do that again. It may not be an easy series win. The West Indies may be competitive and show some good fighting character, as we've already talked about before. But you would think Australia to win 2-0. In terms of leading run scorer, I've gone with Mitchell Marsh as my prediction. I think Mitchell Marsh had a pretty good series against Pakistan. I think he should have a good series here against the West Indies. So I've gone with him as the leading run scorer. Leading wicket taker, I've gone with Pat Cummins. He had a good series against Pakistan, led from the front of the ball. I think he's going to do the same again in this series against the West Indies. So I've gone with him as my leading wicket taker. Now, my final thoughts to conclude on our preview today of this Test series between Australia and the West Indies. My thoughts to end on, but also looking from my perspective in terms of what I expect from the series. Well, Australia and the West Indies have a rich cricketing history. We all know that, starting way back since 1930, when both teams played their first ever Test match against each other. And over the years, Australia and the West Indies have produced some great performances over the years. The Thai Test, obviously, 1960-61 in Brisbane at the Gabba. That famous Test match in Adelaide back in 1992-93, where the West Indies won by a run. Justin Langer made his Test debut for Australia in that Test. He tells a great story about his Test debut in that Test match in Adelaide. That was a famous match. Also, the run chase that the West Indies chased down 418 in Antigua back in 2003 was memorable. So Australia and the West Indies have produced some memorable cricket over the years. Some good cricketers have come out from both countries as well. From my perspective in this series, I hope, like many others listening or watching this episode would hope, that the West Indies are competitive at least. If they're competitive, show some good fight, and stay in the contest if they can with bat and ball against Australia. If they can make Australia work hard, then I think that's a very good thing for the West Indies. I think everyone wants to see the West Indies do well. They want them to be competitive. The rebuild is going to take time, but as I mentioned before, cricket is stronger if we have a strong West Indies. So I think realistically, the West Indies, if they can show competitiveness and fight and stay in the contest, I think that's a good result for them. Australia should win. You know, it's more likely they would dominate with bat and ball in all departments, even in the field. Australia's a very good side. They've been playing well of late. They've won the World Test Championship. They've retained the Ashes. They've done a lot of things over the last few months to a year. Pat Cummins as captain has led from the front, and no doubt he'll do the same in this series against the West Indies. So they should dominate. They should win the series, Australia. But I think if the West Indies can show a bit of competitiveness and fight, I think that's what everyone wants them to do. So purely from a cricketing point of view, if the West Indies are competitive and show some fight, I think that will be a good result. And I think that's what everyone wants to see in the series. But with this Australian team being so dominant the way they are, that's looking more and more less likely. But let's hope that's not the case, and let's hope the West Indies, can play some good cricket. They've got some good players that are talented and skilled, even though they're a young, inexperienced side. But they've got some players who can be talented and can also surprise a lot of people as well. So let's wait and see what the West Indies can do in this Test series against Australia. Well, thanks everyone for listening to our Test series preview between Australia and the West Indies. Stay tuned for more episodes and live streams on the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast from the Australia-West Indies Test series. If you're watching or listening to this episode of the podcast on our YouTube channel, let us know your thoughts on this Test series between Australia and the West Indies in the comments. We would love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.